Why do they keep hurting you again and again with the same hands that once reached for your light? Why does your kindness rot in their mouths like fruit, too ripe, too easy to consume? And more importantly, what secret are you missing? What buried mechanism, veiled in the shadow, allows pain to enter your gates disguised as love, concern, or silence? You feel it, don't you? The pattern, the repetition, the ache of betrayal wrapped in familiar faces. But what if the answer has never been about them, but about something far darker, far more inconvenient within you? You were taught that goodness protects you, that virtue creates immunity. But Schopenhauer would scoff. The world, he said, is not a poem of justice but a theater of will, blind, insatiable, and indifferent to your nobility. In this realm, pain is currency, and those who do not learn how to guard their soul will spend it piece by piece in the name of harmony. What if the very traits you cherish, empathy, availability, forgiveness, have been silently weaponized against you? What if your open heart has become their favorite access point? You see, suffering does not always arrive with cruelty. Often it walks in gently, wearing your reflection. And the ones who hurt you most are not those who hate you, but those who know how deeply you wish to be seen, understood, needed. They press the bruise you've hidden beneath smiles. They test the limits of your self-respect, disguised as closeness. And the most terrifying part, you let them. Not because you're weak, but because you still hope they'll change. But what if that hope is the leash? Now imagine there is a way, an unseen method, quiet yet absolute, that shifts the power without shouting, that stops the hurt not by confrontation, but by transformation. A dark hack not born of malice, but of clarity, a reconfiguration of energy, posture, presence. This isn't about revenge, it's about reversal, about turning the mirror so that those who wounded you are forced to see what they cannot control. But this knowledge isn't handed out freely. It must be earned, or rather remembered. So the question isn't whether they will hurt you again. It's whether you're still allowing the wound to remain open. There is a threshold, a line in the psyche, after which nothing is quite the same. Once crossed, no one can touch you the same way, not because they won't try, but because what once invited the damage no longer exists. But how do you cross it? That is where the descent begins. Stay and you'll see. Leave and the wound will continue to whisper. Underneath every wound lies a question no one dares to ask aloud. Why do they keep hurting me, even when I give them no reason? Why does pain revisit the same doors it once shattered? There is a shadow law at work, ancient, silent, and merciless. You may call it fate or perhaps weakness disguised as virtue, but the truth is simpler and far more dangerous. People do not hurt what they fear losing. They only scar what they feel is theirs to harm. And you, perhaps without knowing, taught them exactly how to treat you. Respect does not bloom in the sunlight of kindness alone. It grows in the cold soil of distance, of unpredictability, of power, not offered freely, but withheld like a sacred fire. You were taught to be kind, to forgive, to offer your heart even when your ribs cracked beneath it. But kindness without boundary is currency in a market that only values scarcity. The more available you are, the more invisible you become. The easier it is to hurt you, the less it feels like a crime. Is it truly their cruelty or your silent permission? When you begin to observe this cruelty not as malice, but as instinct, an echo of the primal mind, you will see how pain becomes a language. People test your silence, they measure your tolerance, and if you never teach them otherwise, they begin to believe you feel nothing at all. To them, your endurance is not strength, it is vacancy. They hurt you not because they are evil, but because they believe they can. They believe you will stay. They believe you are the wall, and they are merely leaning. What if I told you the only way to stop the bleeding is not to ask them to change, but to vanish from the place where their hands can reach? What if the true hack, the hidden door, the unspoken cure, is not forgiveness, but mystery? You must become unreadable, unreachable, a shadow they cannot predict nor possess. The moment they no longer know where you are, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, they lose the weapon. What they cannot see, they cannot strike. What they cannot expect, they cannot control. And here lies the rupture. This transformation is not about vengeance. It is not about teaching them a lesson. It is about unlearning the lie that says you must stay present to be loved. Some loves only flourish in absence. Some souls only awaken when faced with silence. When you become a ghost to those who only saw your flesh, they are forced to remember your soul, and that is when the pain stops, not because you became harder, but because you became sacred, untouchable, unavailable, and finally, unbreakable. They never see it coming, the silence, not the loud kind that screams, "I'm done," but the subtle one that vanishes mid-sentence, mid-pattern, mid-expectation. The silence that once replied at midnight now lingers unread. The presence they leaned on like a crutch now dissolves into absence, cold and absolute. It's not revenge, it's revelation, because nothing disorients the predator more than the disappearance of its prey. You become the question that haunts, not the answer that heals. You become a mirror they can't break, only reflect into. This is the dark inversion they never taught you, that not all light is safe and not all shadows are evil. Some darkness protects, some mystery heals. When you stop explaining yourself, they begin to wonder. When you stop showing up, they begin to look inward. And when they no longer have access to your wounds, they are forced to confront their own. This is not punishment. It is disruption. The kind that awakens, the kind that terrifies, not because it screams, but because it watches silently from a place they can't name. But don't be fooled. This path isn't painless. There is grief in becoming untouchable. There is sorrow in stepping out of a story you once believed was yours to fix. You will be tempted to return, to clarify, to remind them of who you were. Don't. The old you was never seen. The old you was never respected. Only the one who disappears, only the one who retreats into sacred distance becomes myth. And myths cannot be violated. They can only be remembered in awe or regret. The moment they start asking where you went, you've already won. Not because they miss you, but because they finally noticed your silence. You've shifted the dynamic without a single word. You've altered the balance not by force, but by absence. You did not fight back. You vanished. And in your vanishing, they are left with the weight of their own echo, with the memory of your presence and the sting of its withdrawal. This is the moment your healing begins, not when they understand you, but when you finally understand your worth. There is a quiet violence in reclaiming yourself, not the kind that spills blood, but the kind that rearranges the soul. You don't shout, you don't accuse, you simply stop giving them access to the places they used to harm. And in that stillness, in that withdrawal, the structure collapses, because it was never your kindness that kept them near, but your availability, your open gates, your predictable forgiveness, your aching hope that they would one day see you. They won't. Not until the door closes with no explanation, no ceremony, only finality. You begin to realize the depth of their dependence was never on your joy, but on your pain. They drank from the well of your self-doubt, drawing strength from every time you questioned your own value. And each time you returned, each time you tried to be softer, more understanding, more enough, they saw not love, but control. Because those who harm do not seek equals. They seek mirrors that do not crack when struck. But you cracked. And from that fracture, something ancient began to rise. Not vengeance, not pride, but clarity. The moment you stop needing them to understand is the moment you step out of their gravity. You no longer orbit their moods, their manipulations, their silent punishments. You become something terrifying to them, free. And freedom, to those who rely on your captivity, is unbearable. So they will try to pull you back, not with love, but with confusion, with guilt. With the nostalgia of the very wounds they caused. They will dress their hooks in memories. Do not bite. They do not miss you. They miss their control. You were never too much. You were simply too visible. And now, as you step behind the curtain of your own sacred space, you become invisible, not as absence, but as mystery. And mystery is power. Let them guess. Let them search. Let them sit in the discomfort of your silence. Because only in that darkness will they ever begin to feel what you carried for so long. And by then, it will be too late. Not because you hate them, but because you finally chose to love yourself louder than their noise. There is a moment, almost imperceptible, when the soul no longer begs. It no longer leans forward, waiting to be seen, heard, or chosen. It simply folds its longing into silence, not as surrender, but as revelation. This is not weakness. It is the final refusal to dance for scraps, the refusal to keep proving to unseeing eyes that you are worthy of softness. And in that refusal, the wound begins to close, not because they apologized, not because they changed, but because you stopped bleeding for them. What they never expected was that your silence would speak louder than your suffering, that your absence would echo louder than your presence. They thought your worth was measured by your willingness to endure. But your true power was never in how much you could take. It was in how little you needed them to validate your existence. The darkness they projected onto you was only a reflection of their own unexamined fears. And when you stopped absorbing it, when you stopped translating their cruelty into excuses, the mirror shattered. You start to see them differently, not as monsters, but as deeply lost children wearing the masks of control. You see how their power was built on your confusion, how their dominance depended on your hesitation. And now that you walk without waiting for their permission, everything shifts. You are not cold. You are no longer burning. You are the ember that chose not to die, and they cannot handle that. Because nothing terrifies the manipulator more than the one who no longer reacts. So you walk, not to escape, but to return, to yourself, to the voice that was buried under layers of guilt and compromise, to the strength that was never loud, but always there, waiting for you to remember. And when you do, when you finally see yourself not through their distortion, but through your own unfiltered clarity, you become untouchable, not invincible, but sacred. They may try to reach you again. They may whisper like ghosts through the cracks in your memory, but you will not answer. Because now, your silence is not emptiness. It is a boundary. It is a monument to the self that refused to stay broken. And yet there is something haunting about the stillness that follows liberation. You expect celebration, but what you find is quiet. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of shedding an identity that once kept you safe. Who are you now that you no longer bend? Now that you no longer build your days around the storms others carry? The absence of pain can feel like a void, because for so long, the ache was proof you were alive. Now, you must learn to live without bleeding, to breathe without apologizing, to walk without flinching at every shadow. But healing is not the opposite of pain, it is the transformation of it. The body remembers even when the mind forgets. You may still recoil when someone raises their voice, still feel your chest tighten when you sense distance. These are not signs of weakness. They are the echoes of a survival that kept you breathing. You do not need to erase them. You only need to greet them with the patience no one offered you. To become the comfort you once begged for. That too is part of the dark hack, learning that power is not only in protecting yourself from others, but in choosing to protect yourself from your own past reactions. And then slowly, the world begins to mirror the shift inside you. You notice the way certain people fade, like illusions dissolving in the morning light. You see how those who fed on your confusion no longer find nourishment. Not because they stopped trying, but because you stopped offering your energy as currency. You no longer explain. You no longer justify. You let people misunderstand you because your peace is no longer dependent on their clarity. This is the sacred detachment, the quiet rebellion that says, I owe no one the sacrifice of my sanity. In this space, respect is no longer something you chase. It is something you radiate, not through aggression, not through performance, but through presence. A presence that does not beg, does not bend, does not barter. You become a force, not because you are untouchable, but because you are deeply rooted. And those who cannot meet you there, who cannot walk beside you without trying to control you, will eventually walk away. Let them. Let the empty chairs remain empty. Your table was never meant to seat those who devour instead of share. There is a moment after the storm when the air feels unnaturally still, when the absence of violence reveals the weight you've been carrying in silence. This is not peace as the world defines it. It is the peace that comes after confrontation, after exposure, after truth. You have looked into the eyes of pain, and instead of flinching, you stayed. You listened to its voice, not to agree, but to understand. And now, something within you no longer kneels where it once begged. What if the end of being hurt was never about others changing, but about you no longer mistaking their chaos for your responsibility? The ones who wounded you may never admit it. The apologies you craved may never arrive. And yet, in this exact absence, you find your freedom. Not as vengeance, not as numbness, but as the quiet refusal to keep bleeding for those who never learned to hold a heart without breaking it. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop offering softness to hands that only ever used it to shape you into silence. And in this withdrawal, not of love but of compliance, you rise. Perhaps this was never about learning to defend yourself, but about remembering that your soul was never meant to be a battleground. You were not born to carry the sharpness of other people's fears. You were not built to absorb the violence of unmet expectations. There is nothing noble in shrinking for the comfort of others. And as you let go, not with bitterness, but with clarity, you begin to feel the outline of who you were before the bruises. A self untouched, not by pain, but by the need to explain it. And now, the world feels different. Not because it has changed, but because you are seeing it with the eyes of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. The illusions fall away, the noise dims. And beneath it all, a quiet knowing takes root, that the most dangerous people are those who have turned their scars into shields, not to hurt, but to protect without apology. You are not broken, you are initiated. Not everyone will understand that. Let them go. So if something stirred within you, if a piece of your silence cracked just enough to let truth in, then this is not the end, but the beginning of a different kind of allegiance, one to yourself. If these words mirrored something you felt but couldn't name, stay close. Comment what moved you, so that others may recognize their own reflection. Share this with those still trapped in a cycle they can't yet see. Subscribe, not to a channel, but to a way of remembering. You were never meant to be hurt to be worthy. You were only waiting to stop pretending you weren't.